Other screen. You can forget the other one, Joe. It's not necessary. And let's look at what's happened in the 13 years since then. On the left, 1982. On the right, 1995. The pink is drug production. The red areas are no longer isolated red dots of terrorism. They're a red swath, a stain across the entire country. The pipeline has been built. There it is. But the narco-terrorists, between the drug runners and the terrorists, they run about half the country. They effectively have control over approximately half of the country's 1,000 municipalities. This is as a result of the British deliberately creating the FARC and the ELN, deliberately taking down the military, and then bringing in, for their protection, as I said, groups like Defense Services Limited, DSL, straight out of the Crown Agents Group, exactly the same type of people like Executive Outcomes who are operating in Africa. Now, the situation that has been created today is one of dual power in Colombia. This is a situation which can be lost very, very quickly, or won very, very quickly as well. The way this happened is, I'll tell you a little story about that pipeline. In the 1980s, when it was going to be built, Occidental Petroleum of Arm & Hammer, who is a long-time London asset, wanted to build this pipeline because they had oil that they had found in the Caño Limón area in the interior of Colombia. And the ELN guerrillas, who had virtually been wiped out by the Colombian military at that point, reached an agreement with Occidental. After a few harassment operations and so on, Occidental decided that they would pay the ELN guerrillas substantial amounts of money to not attack the pipeline. So Occidental and Mannesmann, a German construction firm, paid millions of dollars to the ELN, and they grew like crazy. In fact, the ELN gained influence, since they were the new security personnel, effectively, of this pipeline, along the entire route of the pipeline. They guaranteed Occidental no problem. The construction equipment with which this was built was painted with ELN slogans and flags. The ELN became almost a hiring hall for the workers working on this pipeline. They gained enormous influence, and they became a major national force as a result of direct financing from these British companies. Now, there was a breakdown in the agreements on this over the last 2 or 3 years between the FARC and the ELN. You can see that this pipeline goes right smack through narco-terrorist territory. There have been, over the last 2 or 3 years, over 1,000 separate terrorist incidents against this pipeline. In some cases, it's been broken with oil spills, in other cases, dented. And it is the estimate of security officials in Colombia that to actually protect this pipeline adequately, you would need 1 soldier every 25 yards. They'd almost have to hold hands all along the way. You would need to protect the thing night and day with armored helicopters and so on. It's running through the middle of a jungle area. Cannot be protected that way unless you get rid of the narco-guerrillas. Now, of course, what happened is that British Petroleum, operating in that same area, has hired the services of Defense Services Limited, DSL, a British mercenary outfit to supposedly provide protection. And what you've effectively got now is privatized armies on both sides waging warfare in no man's land. Now, one of the most amazing security situations anywhere in the world that has developed, as far as I've been able to figure out, is right at the northward turn of the pipeline, right as it enters the second red area. This is the Samore oil block, which is owned by BP. And in this Samore oil field, there is a national park, a nature park. The ELN are active. And there's an Indian group. They're called the Uwa Indians. There's 5,000 of them. They've been organized by the ELN, and they have told British Petroleum that if British Petroleum doesn't stop its activities, they, the Uwas, will commit collective suicide by jumping off a cliff. I guess holding hands or something and go down. Now, they claim that they did this once before in their history. There's a history of this indigenous movement. Could I make this up? They claim that they committed suicide once before in there, which raises a certain question, right? But so there's this whole game going on now. And the government is completely absent. The nation state is being destroyed. Who's behind this? The drug trade, and who is sponsoring them? The British. In this case, the House of Lords plays a very prominent role. President Clinton, 2 years running, has correctly and courageously, against the advice of many of his own advisors, decertified the Samper government of Colombia for non-cooperation in drugs. Now, that's the very least one can say about Samper. He should be decertified for full cooperation with the Cali cartel to the tune of $6 million, which got him the presidency of Colombia. Clinton correctly decertified him. The British, the House of Lords, immediately went into an uproar, orchestrated with Samper. And Viscount Montgomery itself led the debate, arguing that the poor government of Samper Pisano had to be protected from the horrible United States, who was doing all of these horrible things, and in discussions with journalists indicated that it was really very important to proceed with the issue of discussing the legalization of drugs. And he also made the information available to this reporter that one of the leaders of the drug legalization debate in London is Lord Mancroft, who Viscount Montgomery assured us was very familiar with this issue of drug legalization and the problems of drugs, because he was himself a reformed drug addict. So you have the likes of Lord Mancroft, Viscount Montgomery, and so on, deployed to transform entire areas like Colombia into drug-producing havens, eliminate the nation state, and in that process completely eliminate the historical basis on which any kind of development has occurred in Ibero-America.
Okay. Now, I think it's also important to understand that despite the fact that the British High Commission in Kampala has a lot to do with the day-to-day running of the Ugandan government, that is really not the way in which the control of what we have, the British control of what we have seen in East Africa is really carried out. More to the point is an article that appeared in the Times of London in October of 1996, right at the very beginning of the Rwandan-Ugandan invasion of Zaire. And the article, in its typical British tone, said, quote, "The West should resist the temptation to blame itself for what's going to happen in Zaire. Certainly, colonial frontiers were drawn that took no account of ethnicity. But this is hindsight, made deceptively simple. Zaire contains some 300 ethnic groups, so just where should lines have been drawn? Closer to the mark is the bleak prospectus set out 35 years ago by a young Algerian radical, Frantz Fanon, in The Wretched of the Earth." And this really gets to the point of how the British intelligence works. Frantz Fanon was the prophet of unprecedented mass murder, to be sure. But this was not the result of indigenous revolutionism on the part of African radicals who were interested in overthrowing colonialism or neo-colonialism. The headquarters for the Frantz Fanon cult and its spread across Africa was Dar es Salaam University, which was a total creation of British intelligence from the top down. British intelligence understands that once imbibed, Fanonism is the controlling element of the psyche of the targeted victim. It compels the victim to ever greater and greater levels of violence of a satanic nihilistic quality. And in fact, I think, as we can see with Museveni himself, it has reached Macbeth proportions. The point of this is that British intelligence has created this not simply through the process of physical hands-on domination, but through the control of the mind. And Museveni was a key victim. First, this is a copy of Museveni's thesis at Dar es Salaam University, which he wrote in 1971. We have the full copy of this now, where he embraces revolutionary violence, and I think it's important to understand that at Dar es Salaam University, he had something called the Student African Revolutionary Front, which he organized and chaired, and that he has just founded a branch of this front at Makerere University in Kampala. So that there is a complete continuity in his own mind from what he was doing and thinking in 1971 to what he is doing and thinking today. Now, let's look at the very first line there. It says, at the level of individuals, violence is a cleansing force. Now, this is interesting because, you know, Museveni is put forward by much of the Western press as the cleanest president in all of Africa, and is known supposedly for not having been corrupt like Moi and Zaire and Abacha and other terrible dictators. And this may be what they actually mean. The major patron of the Dar es Salaam University was Bertrand Russell. He was the intellectual godfather of Dar es Salaam, who, as Lynn said yesterday, is somebody who believed that the yellow, brown, and black populations must be reduced at all costs, no matter how disgusting the method that is used to do this. So in Dar es Salaam, you actually see a factory, a menticide factory, a factory that is going to produce the killers and the martyr lord force in Africa and elsewhere that will be willing to carry out the disgusting methods used to decimate this population. That is exactly what Dar es Salaam was. The money funding this university came from the Ford Foundation, whose president at the time was McGeorge Bundy, whom we've also heard about in the last 2 days. The Rockefeller Foundation, the British Aid Agency, and the Aga Khan Foundation. And the school's faculty represented an amalgamation of the offspring of the British Fabian Society and Russellites and Third World Party communists. But if you look into the history in detail of many of these Third World communist parties, you find that their headquarters are in London, that the chief person among them or the leadership of them tends to be far more British-oriented, and that they don't really, they are certainly shared assets, if shared at all, with Russia. Okay, now Museveni's thesis really gives you an idea of the flavor of the ideas fostered. He says, not only is violence the only effective instrument of bringing about the real overthrow of colonial rule, it is also a laxative, a purgative, an agent for creating new men. He quotes Fanon as saying that violence alone, violence committed by the people, violence organized and educated by its leaders, makes it possible for the masses to understand social truths and gives the key to them. He says, when the oppressed, the native of the white man, opens machine gun fire on the oppressor and mows him down, he kills 2 birds with 1 stone. He discovers that on the one hand he is a man at par with any other free man that one may care to bring forward, and that his former oppressor is apparently also a human being, destructible and mortal. And lastly, he says, the peasant in Cabo Delgado, Mozambique, has participated in killing the white man, the former demigod. He has inflicted defeat on this god. The white god, the colonialist, has been seen and known to writhe in an agony of death from bullets fired by guns operated by peasants. The peasants have set mines which have blown to pieces white soldiers. The erstwhile gods have been seen to fly like startled warthogs before the automatic fire by peasant guerrillas. They have been captured by peasants. They have put up their arms in supplication for mercy from their former slaves, the natives. The gods are known to be weaklings when it comes to standing the rigors of bush life. The Portuguese prisoners in Frelimo's hands fall sick more often than not. Some had to be supported to enable me to take their photographs. They were too sick from minor causes, which would never cause a peasant to fall sick. The white man, an invulnerable god, will be seen vomiting, shivering, and expressing anxiety about what he considers imminent death. Now, this gives you an idea of the tone of the celebration of death and violence that is represented by this by the school of Frantz Fanon, which is so widespread throughout the world today and has reached its apotheosis in Museveni. And the point is that, of course, and what we've seen in the last 5 years, not very many white colonialists have died. And even more tragically, next, probably half, at least, of the 5 million death toll that it has taken to destroy the nation state in East Africa are children. These are Rwandan children, Hutu refugees in 1997. Next. And here they are in 1994. When they first came out of Rwanda, they looked a lot better, but it is very likely that these children that you see here are no longer alive. So this is what has been unleashed. And I think that unless we are able to call to account the British Empire, unless the United States is able to call the British Empire to account for this mass murder, then very shortly God will call us all to account for it. Thank you.
If you're distressed and slightly sickened by the picture which Linda has painted of the kind of genocide that's going on in Africa, that's of course appropriate. There's probably a certain amount of feeling also that we're talking here about a particularly sick mind in the case of Museveni or Kabila and so forth, and that things like that are really aberrations, and they often happen in far-off places, in the recesses of Africa and so on and so forth, and there's an underlying anxious feeling that it somehow can't or it won't happen here. It can and it is in Ibero-America, and as Tony will explain in the subsequent presentation, in the United States itself. The exact same thing, menticide, especially menticide, the destruction of human minds as well as human bodies. We have, up till now, reviewed the parallels on the banking side, the British control of the banking takeover of Africa, the British control of the banking takeover of Ibero-America, the mining aspect, the looting of raw materials. In Africa, the same British companies as in Ibero-America. In the third segment, the destruction of the nation state, the introduction of private armies, executive outcomes, Defense Systems Limited, and so on. The exact same companies operating in Ibero-America today. And in this concluding section, I want to deal with this issue which Linda has just raised of the destruction of the concept of man without which no human, actually human existence can live, because the concept that underlies and that is quite explicit in the quotes that she just read from Museveni really need to be diagnosed and discussed. And unfortunately, the same factory which produced Museveni has produced much of the leadership of the Jacobin hordes of Ibero-America, and is also producing the menticide occurring inside the United States today. Now, I want to take a brief case study of the MST of Brazil, the so-called Movimiento Sin Tierra, the landless movement. And one could just as readily talk about the FARC or the ELN of Colombia or any of the other groups of Fidel Castro's Sao Paulo Forum. But I want to talk about the MST for a variety of reasons. In one sense, it's far more dangerous than the others because of what it means to be operating this way in Brazil in particular, and because it demonstrates one aspect of the story, of the parallel, the Africanization of Ibero-America that is most evident here. I want to also say from the outset that the LaRouche movement has crossed swords with the MST repeatedly in Brazil over the course of their history and ours. In many sense, in fact, the future of Ibero-America, as in other continents around the world, will be shaped by that battle, will be decided by that battle, whether the MSTs and the creators of the MST are victorious, or rather if the concept of man, which our movement and LaRouche represents, dominates, or not. We want to tell the story of the MST, and in particular of one of its guiding ideologues, Paulo Freire. You may or may not have heard of him. Paulo Freire is most famous for a theory of education, so-called, which is called deschooling. It's the idea that what you do is you use language and education to deconstruct people's minds. You use this to induce class suicide, that's quote unquote, class suicide, so that people's mental oppression from imperialism and westernization disappears. One of the other notorious crimes of Paulo Freire is that he's the inventor of the phrase, the totally contentless, meaningless phrase, empowerment. That's where it comes from. If you've ever wondered what it means to be empowered, I still haven't figured it out. I mean, if you think you know, you have a problem. That comes from Paulo Freire. Now, Paulo Freire comes from Dar es Salaam, the Ford Foundation's Dar es Salaam, the same place, the same cookie factory that produced Museveni. In fact, he was there in 1971, just a couple of years after Museveni was there. He went and worked with Frelimo, the Mozambique Liberation Army, the same people that Museveni went and did field work with to produce the study which you just heard Linda read about. And they're both products of the same philosophical school, the British fascist, pessimistic, nihilistic school of Heidegger, Sartre, and Frantz Fanon. This pessimism, this cultural pessimism, this nihilism, which in France goes by the name of existentialism, is the underlying problem. Now, but first to the case of the MST so that you know what we're dealing with politically. The first transparency, please. The MST, the Landless Movement, is a group of about 5,000 hardcore cadre in Brazil. Their actual leadership is unknown. They have a couple of well-known public figures, but their real leadership is secretive. They were created in the 1980s out of the Theology of Liberation movement in the Catholic Church. They're closely associated with the PT, or the Workers' Party of Brazil, and with the pastoral commissions of the church, the CPTs. In Brazil as well. They have engaged in land invasions across Brazil. Each of the red dots shows an area of special activity of the MST, areas where they have invaded land. Their cry is that Brazil has 12 million landless and they deserve to have the land back. And so they take over land. Oh, what sort of land do they take over? Well, one of their main areas of activity, as you can see in the orange shaded area in the south, is the most productive agricultural land of Brazil. It's the soybean emporium of Brazil. A huge amount of production goes on there. In 1990, in Rio Grande do Sul, in the southernmost part of Brazil, the MST took over a major hydroelectric plant and area around a petrochemical factory. In 1996, they announced that they were going to take over the land surrounding the Navy's Aramar Technological Center, where the Navy was engaged in the project of developing a nuclear submarine. In 1996, the MST announced that they were going to take over and seize Tucuruí Dam. Tucuruí Dam is in the north of the country, part of the Carajás project. It is the second largest dam in the world. Those are their targets, infrastructure. The MST acts like what it is, an irregular army for a foreign invasion. And the masters are the British. Their purpose is to shatter Brazil, destroy it, fragment it, playing on the very real poverty, misery, and difficulties that do exist in the country. Now, their very specific objective, we can see in the next transparency, is the creation of a Pontal Republic. That was that shaded area I showed you in the south of Brazil. It is not only the richest agricultural area, there's a number of other very interesting things going on there. First of all, the shaded orange triangle right in the middle is the Pontal region. That's where two rivers come together in Brazil. They have taken over almost that entire area. There's 3,000 families there in 16 camps. Just across the river to the south in the state of Paraná, there's another 8,000 families in 98 camps. And they are spreading throughout this entire yellow shaded area. They want to convert it into an independent republic. They want to secede from Brazil. Now, what else do you have in the area? Well, first of all, you have the world's largest hydroelectric dam. That's the big triangle down there. That's Itaipu. Until Three Gorges is completed, Itaipu is the largest dam in the world. It produces an enormous quantity of electricity. Some of it goes to Paraguay, not much, because they don't have much to use it on there. And the vast majority is used in Brazil, especially in the industrial heartland around Sao Paulo. And there is a high tension wire, a cable, which is the dotted black line, running right smack through the area that the MST wants to convert into the Pontal Republic. Itaipu alone produces 22% of the electricity consumed in Brazil. The surrounding area, as shown by the black triangles, is filled with other major hydroelectric projects, which produce another 25% of the electricity consumed in the country. 47% of Brazil's electricity is generated in that area which the MST is trying to make independent. You begin to get the idea. That's not all. The black and white dotted line is an existing railroad from Sao Paulo going up to Bolivia, and they are currently constructing a natural gas pipeline along the side of the railroad to bring natural gas from Bolivia, from the Mutun and other deposits, down into Sao Paulo where it's needed. So that's another part of crucial industrial infrastructure that's going on there. In addition, it's important to note that right around Sao Paulo, there are two other smaller cities called Campinas and São José dos Campos, which are the science and technological center of Brazil. There's a little triangle around the Sao Paulo area, which has been the heart of scientific and technological development of Brazil. Brazil has made significant strides in a number of areas: aerospace, nuclear energy, and so on and so forth. And a lot of it comes out of the development in that area, also immediately targeted. So you can see, this is, if the British can achieve this, if they can pull this off through the MST, think of what that means in terms of those low percentages of British control of banking and mining in Brazil relative to the rest of Ibero-America. Think of that $207 billion asset block that the Brazilian state still controls. Think of what the mining potential of Brazil is, and think of what it means to shatter that nation state. You will have unleashed a process of Jacobin dismemberment of nations which will not stop in Brazil. It will spread across South America. It will not stop in South America. It will spread into Central America and Mexico. And it will not stop there. This is on our border. And this is what the British are doing. When Brazil blows, the whole hemisphere blows. And that's what the MST is up to. Now, the MST, the landless movement, it's not properly named. They're currently organizing the homeless to do the same thing, invade buildings. The jobless, the same thing, to invade factories. And they're organizing all of the disenfranchised, all of the wretched of Brazil, as Fanon might have put it, into a Jacobin horde for destruction and chaos. They are properly called not the landless movement, but the mindless movement. Not only because they themselves are mindless, they are, and you'll hear it in a minute, but because that is the state which they are deliberately trying to induce in the entire population at British behest. The mindless movement, like Museveni, the mindless movement. They're organizing in the urban slums, the favelas. They're working with the drug runners to do this, and they're playing on the pessimism, the irrationalism, the rage generated in these populations by the destruction that's going on. And they're trying to organize this into a disorganized, deconstructive Jacobin horde. That's what they're doing. Now, the MST has been trained by the FARC and by Sendero Luminoso, Shining Path in Peru. When they take over an area, what they do is they protect it. Their security squads come in first. They build camouflaged pits that are camouflaged with leaves and branches, Viet Cong style. This is where they learned it from. And at the bottom of the pits, they have very sharp stakes or wooden poles, on top of which they spread human excrement, so that anyone who falls into these pits is, of course, immediately pierced, and the feces enters their bloodstream, immediate death. The second thing that happens with the MST after their security brigades move in is their education brigades move in. And what they do is they recite or chant revolutionary poetry, probably translations of Dryden, chanted in sing-song pattern, no doubt. And they also pledge their allegiance to the MST flag every morning. And their pledge is the following: I am the MST flag. My red color represents the blood of dead peasants. Shades of Museveni. But it gets worse. In 1995, an MST leader by the name of Marcio Lima said, "It would be better for us if the army massacred us." And the national spokesman for the MST, João Pedro Stedile, in 1996 said the following: "The interior of Brazil can become a Colombia." Remember the map. It can become a Colombia. Things will be out of control. There will be social convulsions, and society will come apart. Next slide, please. We are chaos, says the MST. At the moment, our forces are small. Open confrontation doesn't interest us. We have to wage a guerrilla war. We have to wage psychological terrorism, destabilization. Things will happen. We don't know what, where, or how. They are part of the destabilization. We are chaos. This is Delman Sergio Ferrell, an MST supporter, in a manifesto in 1996, issued at the point they were trying to take over the Tucuruí Dam, which was signed. It was called the Unabomber. That's what they called it. Couldn't make that up. You ask, who in the world could support this insanity? This psychotic, bestial insanity? Well, the Queen of England, of course. Who else? Take a look at the next slide. One of the leaders of the MST, Deolinda Alves, who is the wife of a leader by the name of José Rainha, was just in London. She was in London. She was there to organize support because of the upcoming trial, the appeal trial of Rainha. He was just convicted to 26 years in jail for having murdered someone in an earlier land invasion. However, the MST says he's a political prisoner, so she went to London and was hosted and taken around there by British-sponsored groups, which I'm going to tell you about in a minute. It's interesting to note that Rainha, among his notable activities, in addition to getting sentenced to 26 years for killing someone, is an avid hater of LaRouche and the LaRouche movement in Brazil. He recently called us delirious and a neo-fascist and possessing a neo-fascist and neo-Nazi mentality. So you can see that we're having a good fight with these people. In fact, in 1994, a couple of years ago, the MST and their associated party, the PT, sued the LaRouche movement in Brazil in court, the MSIA, because we had put out a pamphlet denouncing them as being part of a one-world international conspiracy to destroy the nation state and so on and so forth, what you've heard here. And what they said against us at the time, in shocked horror and disbelief, they said that we, the LaRouche movement, had accused them of being tied to a network of international drug trafficking and terrorism, which, according to its absurd thesis, seeks to destabilize governments and destroy sovereign states and their armed forces. The suit was thrown out of court by a judge on the grounds that the publications of the PT and the MST themselves proved our point. Now, exactly how do the London strings work here? Well, this is one level of the London strings. I'm going to talk about the real strings in a minute, the strings of mind. But at one level, this is interesting, because the group that invited Deolinda Alves, the wife of José Rainha, to London, is a group called Christian Aid, which you can see, second from the left on the bottom there. Christian Aid, as Jeff mentioned in his opening statement, is part of the Crown Agents Foundation. It is a British group which is the official representative of all 40 British and Irish churches. In other words, it is a representation of the Church of England. They invited Deolinda Alves to London and gave her an enormous amount of support, publicity, and so on, and they're going to be in Brazil for the appeals trial. Now, who else has backed the MST, just to get an idea of this? Well, there's another group which is called the Right Livelihood Foundation. This is a Swedish group, at least apparently a Swedish group. It's run by a Swedish nobleman by the name of Jakob Wexell, who lives in London, and who gives out an annual prize which is known as the Alternate Nobel Prize, because it's given in the Swedish Parliament the day before the Nobel Prize is given. In 1991, the Right Livelihood Foundation gave their award to Father Ricardo Rezende of the MST. 250 grand, not bad. Their other awards have been in earlier years to the Gaia Foundation and to Amory Lovins of Friends of the Earth. A third British group, to show the strings on this puppet, is the Anti-Slavery International. Anti-Slavery International describes itself as the oldest human rights organization in the world, having been founded in 1787 by old British oligarchical families, the Wilberforce family and the Buxtons. Buxton today is the vice president of the Worldwide Fund for Nature. So that also is part of the channel of control onto the MST. And the Belgians, never to be outdone by their British cousins, recently gave their annual King Baldwin Foundation Award of $120,000 to, you guessed it, the MST for, quote, socioeconomic development of the third world. Now, the King Baldwin Foundation in 1980 had given its award to Paulo Freire, and in the 1930s, the Belgian monarchy in the form of King Leopold had backed Hitler. So at least they cannot be accused of inconsistency. So that's one level of the British control. However, the real aspect, the real control on this, and the far more worrisome, and that it is the field in which we really must do our central battle, is in the area of ideas, the idea of concepts, the concept of man that is spread by someone like Museveni or by the MST. In one sense, it's a misnomer to refer to this as the invisible empire. It's invisible only in one sense. In point of fact, it is quite visible to the mind's eye. It may be invisible from the sense of sense perception, but it is actually far more real. It is a far more actual, existent power in the universe than mere individuals, organizations, flowcharts, and so on and so forth. It is that area in which the battle actually occurs. I want to talk about Paulo Freire because that is the area, that is the representative of this level of the battle. Paulo Freire, the guy who coined the phrase empowerment, was born in 1921 in Recife, Brazil. He was educated in Recife. He got a degree in education there in 1959. From 1964 to 1969, he worked for UNESCO, Julian Huxley's UNESCO, in Chile. In 1969, for the next year and a half, he went to Harvard, where he worked with a Harvard education program, including field activity in the United States, which is something we ought to look into, find out what he was doing. In 1970, he moved to Geneva, where he was employed for the next 2.5 decades by the World Council of Churches as a consultant on the subject of quote-unquote education. They principally deployed him to Africa. Now, what did Freire do in Africa for the World Council of Churches? And mind you, you'll hear about this in Tony's presentation. The World Council of Churches can be described perhaps as a kind of ecumenical front group of the Church of England combined with the British Colonial Office. That's what the World Council of Churches is. It's an international deployment of the Church of England. This is British we're talking about. What was Freire doing on the World Council of Churches payroll in Africa? The next transparency, please. In Freire's own words, he said the following: the World Council of Churches had lent strong support to many African liberation movements even before my participation. I was not the one who initiated the involvement of the World Council with these movements. The World Council never ceased to give assistance to those liberation movements, such as the ones Linda has described. In the 1971 collection of essays, which included the study by Museveni, which Linda was just reading from, in that very same pamphlet, in the introduction, lengthy praise is expressed for Paulo Freire. And what the author of the introduction says about Freire is the following, and I quote, "He has elaborated on Fanon's theory and broken new ground. There is a strong case for a new guerrilla armed only with the kind of teaching and learning techniques described by educationalists like Freire." Now, what are those learning techniques? Freire's most famous book is called Pedagogy of the Oppressed. It's like The Wretched of the Earth of Fanon. What it is, it's a manual for recruiting to Jacobin hordes of the sort I've just described in the case of the MST, or the Kabila movement, or Museveni's movement. It's a manual for recruiting based on induced existentialism, nihilism, and pessimism as a worldview. Induced. Freire worked with the top leadership of the guerrilla movements of Mozambique, Cape Verde, Angola, and other countries in Africa. And in Ibero-America, his policies were implemented as the quote-unquote educational policy in Cuba, in Nicaragua, in many parts of Brazil, and so on. This guy was all over the place on the payroll of the World Council of Churches. What is his concept of education? Well, I'll tell you what it's not. It ain't Platonic. Next slide, please. Paulo Freire, in a 1970 writing, published most appropriately in the Harvard Educational Review, says the following: "Socratic intellectualism, which mistook the definition of the concept for knowledge of the thing defined, and this knowledge is virtue, did not constitute a true pedagogy of knowing. Plato's theory of dialogue failed to go beyond the Socratic theory." Right? So what he is saying is that Plato is wrong for trying to define knowledge as actually a concept as opposed to knowledge of a thing, of a specific thing. And in the immediate next paragraph, next slide please, Freire puts forward his idea of what his adult literacy proposals and programs implemented. He said the following: "The adult literacy process must engage the learners in the constant problematizing," whatever that means, it's like empowerment, I guess. It's interesting, we put this through the computer for spell check and it stopped at problematizing, so, which simply proves that Paulo Freire is stupider than a computer, and that's very stupid. So, the adult literacy process must engage the learners in the constant problematizing of their existential situations, employing generative words chosen by specialized educators in a preliminary investigation of the, quote, minimal linguistic universe of the future learners. The minimal linguistic universe. The words are chosen for their pragmatic value as linguistic signs which command a common understanding." Now, this is pure radical nominalism. The only thing which is real is the name or the label on a thing. No verbs, only things, no change, only objects which exist, and if you can put a label on it, especially if it's in your minimal linguistic universe, not a lot of things, just a little thing, few things, it's very important. That is what actual knowledge is, according to Paulo Freire. Now, let's compare this. Think of Plato. Think of Plato's concept. Think in particular of what he does in the Meno with a slave boy. Right? It's important to remember that slave boy. Let's actually get that other slide, Joe. It's an image that people need to have in their mind while we're discussing this aspect of what actual knowledge is. No, number 34. It's the kids, the children. Yeah. In the Meno, Plato is able to show the stupid people who he's trying to educate that he can induce in the mind of even a slave boy the creation of a concept of geometry which is far beyond anything that the Aristotelians that he's otherwise talking to are capable of. And he shows that it is possible to create in the mind, or induce the creation in the mind of another person, of a concept. Now think of what that idea of learning and knowledge versus what Freire is talking about here and his minimal linguistic universe. Freire's proposal is to take people who have the potential, as the slave boy in Meno has that potential, and to instead turn them into slaves through radical nominalism, through menticide. And it's a very intentional program. It's a Tavistockian program. This approach to knowledge or education has been polemicized against many times. It's not only Plato. Let's look at what Cusa had to say on this in one of his dialogues, a Platonic dialogue called The Layman About Mind. Because Cusa addresses exactly this issue of what real knowledge is. Is it names? Or is there something else, something beyond? And Cusa says, mind is the power in us which embraces conceptually the exemplars of all things. Mind is a living substance. Its function in this body is to give it life, and because of this, it is called soul. Mind is a substantial form of power. Now, Cusa had also said, genus, in the same dialogue, genus and species, insofar as they are matters of naming, are mental constructs which human reason has made for itself. Now, again, insofar as the mind creates names, names do exist, but they are the result of a prior mental activity. There is a prior mental activity which can provide names for things, but the names of those things is not the knowledge. There's a prior process, which is this. What is that process? It is the power of the mind to embrace conceptually the exemplars of all things, or Plato's concept of ideas or forms is the same thing. And it is this substantial power of mind, which he calls soul as well, it is what gives our body life, and it is what makes man imago viva Dei. The next transparency, please. Because he says, our mind is the image of that infinite being. Knowledge of God, his face, is accessible only in mental reality whose object is truth. It is not further accessible except through mind, so that mind may be the image of God. If with Freire, or Aristotle, or Museveni, or Sartre, or Heidegger, you deny the existence or you destroy the mind such that it not have that capability of concept creation prior to naming things, you are destroying that within man which makes him as in the image of God. You're making him a beast. It's menticide. You will produce beasts like Museveni. You will produce beasts like Kabila. You will produce beasts like the MST. Because you are forcibly indoctrinating and brainwashing people to destroy that capability which distinctly and uniquely is, as Cusa defines, what makes man as in the image of God. But Freire was even worse. Freire was actually against language altogether. He thought that what should be taught in Portuguese Africa was not brainwashed, decorticated Portuguese nouns. He was in favor of Creole. Just the same way that Swahili, right? The Swahili example Linda was talking about. He was for Creole. And in fact, at one point, Freire, the consummate racist, says that pantomime is the natural language of Africans. Shades of Al Jolson. And now this got to be a heated debate between Freire and some of his almost equally revolutionary comrades. In Cape Verde, for example, they refused. They said it should be Portuguese. We want to brainwash people in Portuguese. And he said, no, you got to brainwash them in Creole. And then he came up with the final put down. He said, quote, "This is a resistance to re-Africanization. or perhaps a subtle refusal on the part of assimilated Cape Verdeans to commit class suicide, close quote. Now, there is another renowned author who, with Cusa, has addressed this issue of language and its relationship to actual knowledge. And with your indulgence, I'm going to read you two paragraphs from Gulliver's Travels. He says, Swift says, "We next went to the School of Languages, where 3 professors sat in consultation upon improving that of their own country. The first project was to shorten discourse by cutting polysyllables into one and leaving out verbs and participles, because in reality, all things imaginable are but nouns. The other was a scheme for entirely abolishing all words whatsoever." Shades of Paulo Freire. "Abolishing all words whatsoever. And this was urged as a great advantage in point of health as well as brevity. For it is plain that every word we speak is in some degree a diminution of our lungs by corrosion, and consequently contributes to the shortening of our lives. An expedient thing was therefore offered, that since words are only names for things, it would be more convenient for all men to carry about them such things as were necessary to express the particular business they are to discourse on. And this invention would certainly have taken place to the great ease as well as health of the subject if the women, in conjunction with the vulgar and illiterate, had not threatened to raise a rebellion, unless they might be allowed the liberty to speak with their tongues after the manner of their forefathers. Such constant, irreconcilable enemies to science are the common people. However, many of the most learned and wise adhere to the new scheme of expressing themselves by things, which hath only this inconvenience attending it, that if a man's business be very great, and of various kinds, he must be obliged in proportion to carry a greater bundle of things upon his back, unless he can afford 1 or 2 strong servants to attend him. I have often beheld 2 of those sages almost sinking under the weight of their packs like peddlers among us, who when they met in the streets would lay down their loads, open their sacks, and hold conversation for an hour together, then put up their implements, help each other to resume their burdens, and take their leave." That's Jonathan Swift on the subject of language and nominalism. In addition to Paulo Freire, I want to conclude with brief mention of 2 of the other mind assassins involved in the MST movement. Leonardo Boff, a Franciscan defrocked monk who's a total psychotic, involved with the Gaia Foundation, a total enemy of the nation state. The next transparency, his view is the following. Mankind is in a difficult transition from the nation state to the world state, from the worldwide to the cosmic, from mass to energy to information and communication, from macro to micro, from materialism to holistic spiritualism. We are standing before a new planetary civilization. Now, Leonardo Boff, like Museveni, also praises Hitler, which is interesting enough. In the next transparency, you will find the following from Boff. Nazism can also be a mediation of the absolute. In Heideggerian thought, a person in jail can be more free than a person outside, because prisons are inside the person. Human beings attach themselves to their own selves and not to external reality. So if this gives you an eerie feeling of deja vu, having seen the quotes from Museveni that Linda referred to, there's a very good reason. They come from the same cookie cutter. And the final person I want to mention among the MST ideologues is Frei Beto, who is a theology of liberation New Ager, who has the following view of the way in which irrationalism must come to replace rationalism in theology, in science, and in organizing. The next slide, please. Frei Beto complained recently that in the West, the universities remain closed to methods of learning and symbolic living, such as intuition, premonition, astrology, Tarot, I Ching, and in the case of Latin America, the religions and the rites and myths of indigenous and African origin. It is this view which was expressed in the concluding statement, next slide, of the 9th Inter-Ecclesiastical Encounter, which is the voice of our enemy. There should be greater respect shown for the growth of Pentecostalism. This is coming from a Brazilian religious meeting. Greater respect shown for the growth of Pentecostalism inside and outside the church. We must overcome certain preconceptions with regard to the members of the Pentecostal churches and inside the Catholic Church for charismatic renewal. There must be greater respect of indigenous myths, rites, and spirituality. And the next speaker, Tony Chaikin, will explain to you what that really means. Thank you very much.
Times of London in October of 1996, right at the very beginning of the Rwandan-Ugandan invasion of Zaire. And the article, in its typical British tone, said, quote, "The West should resist the temptation to blame itself for what's going to happen in Zaire. Certainly, colonial frontiers were drawn that took no account of ethnicity. But this is hindsight, made deceptively simple. Zaire contains some 300 ethnic groups, so just where should lines have been drawn? Closer to the mark is the bleak prospectus set out 35 years ago by a young Algerian radical, Frantz Fanon, in The Wretched of the Earth." And this really gets to the point of how the British intelligence works. Frantz Fanon was the prophet of unprecedented mass murder, to be sure. But this was not the result of indigenous revolutionism on the part of African radicals who were interested in overthrowing colonialism or neo-colonialism. The headquarters for the Frantz Fanon cult and its spread across Africa was Dar es Salaam University, which was a total creation of British intelligence from the top down. British intelligence understands that once imbibed, Fanonism is the controlling element of the psyche of the targeted victim. It compels the victim to ever greater and greater levels of violence of a satanic nihilistic quality. And in fact, I think as we can see with Museveni himself, it has reached Macbeth proportions. The point of
the British, the House of Lords, immediately went into an uproar, orchestrated with Samper. And Viscount Montgomery itself led the debate, arguing that the poor government of Samper Pisano had to be protected from the horrible United States who was doing all of these horrible things, and in discussions with journalists indicated that it was really very important to proceed with the issue of discussing the legalization of drugs. And he also made the information available to this reporter that one of the leaders of the drug legalization debate in London is Lord Mancroft, who Viscount Montgomery assured us was very familiar with this issue of drug legalization and the problems of drugs because he was himself a reformed drug addict. So you have the likes of Lord Mancroft, Viscount Montgomery, and so on, deployed to transform entire areas like Colombia into drug-producing havens, eliminate the nation-state, and in that process, completely eliminate the historical basis on which any kind of development has occurred in Ibero-America.
Okay. Now, I think it's also important to understand that despite the fact that the British High Commission in Kampala has a lot to do with the day-to-day running of the Ugandan government, that is really not the way in which the control of what we have, the British control of what we have seen in East Africa is really carried out. More to the point is an article that appeared in the
world that has developed, as far as I've been able to figure out, is right at the northward turn of the pipeline, right as it enters the second red area, this is the Samore oil block, which is owned by BP. And in this Samore oil field, there is a national park, a nature park. The ELN are active, and there's an Indian group. They're called the Uwa Indians. There's 5,000 of them. They've been organized by the ELN, and they have told British Petroleum that if British Petroleum doesn't stop its activities, they, the Uwas, will commit collective suicide by jumping off a cliff. I guess holding hands or something and go down. Now, they claim that they did this once before in their history. There's a history of this indigenous movement. Could I make this up? They claim that they committed suicide once before in there, which raises a certain question, right? But so there's this whole game going on now. And the government is completely absent. The nation state is being destroyed. Who's behind this? The drug trade, and who is sponsoring them? The British. In this case, the House of Lords plays a very prominent role. President Clinton, 2 years running, has correctly and courageously, against the advice of many of his own advisors, decertified the Samper government of Colombia for non-cooperation in drugs. Now, that's the very least one can say about Samper. He should be decertified for full cooperation with the Cali cartel to the tune of $6 million, which got him the presidency of Colombia. Clinton correctly decertified him to not attack the pipeline. So Occidental and Mannesmann, a German construction firm, paid millions of dollars to the ELN, and they grew like crazy. In fact, the ELN gained influence, since they were the new security personnel, effectively, of this pipeline, along the entire route of the pipeline. They guaranteed Occidental no problem. The construction equipment with which this was built was painted with ELN slogans and flags. The ELN became almost a hiring hall for the workers working on this pipeline. They gained enormous influence, and they became a major national force as a result of direct financing from these British companies. Now, there was a breakdown in the agreements on this over the last 2 or 3 years between the FARC and the ELN. You can see that this pipeline goes right smack through narco-terrorist territory. There have been, over the last 2 or 3 years, over 1,000 separate terrorist incidents against this pipeline. In some cases, it's been broken with oil spills, in other cases, dented. And it is the estimate of security officials in Colombia that to actually protect this pipeline adequately, you would need 1 soldier every 25 yards. They'd almost have to hold hands all along the way. You would need to protect the thing night and day with armored helicopters and so on. It's running through the middle of a jungle area. Cannot be protected that way unless you get rid of the narco-guerrillas. Now, of course, what happened is that British Petroleum, operating in that same area, has hired the services of Defense Services Limited, DSL, a British mercenary outfit to supposedly provide protection. And what you've effectively got now is privatized armies on both sides waging warfare in no man's land. Now, one of the most amazing security situations anywhere in the other screen, you can forget the other one, Joe, it's not necessary. And let's look at what's happened in the 13 years since then. On the left, 1982. On the right, 1995. The pink is drug production. The red areas are no longer isolated red dots of terrorism. They're a red swath, a stain across the entire country. The pipeline has been built. There it is. But the narco-terrorists, between the drug runners and the terrorists, they run about half the country. They effectively have control over approximately half of the country's 1,000 municipalities. This is as a result of the British deliberately creating the FARC and the ELN, deliberately taking down the military, and then bringing in, for their protection, as I said, groups like Defense Services Limited, DSL, straight out of the Crown Agents Group, exactly the same type of people like Executive Outcomes who are operating in Africa. Now, the situation that has been created today is one of dual power in Colombia. This is a situation which can be lost very, very quickly, or won very, very quickly as well. The way this happened is, I'll tell you a little story about that pipeline. In the 1980s, when it was going to be built, Occidental Petroleum of Arm & Hammer, who is a longtime London asset, wanted to build this pipeline because they had oil that they had found in the Caño Limón area in the interior of Colombia. And the ELN guerrillas, who had virtually been wiped out by the Colombian military at that point, reached an agreement with Occidental. After a few harassment operations and so on, Occidental decided that they would pay the ELN guerrillas substantial amounts of money